In June 2025, the world's attention turned to the remote mountain village of Kananaskis, Canada, a place known for its breathtaking landscapes and tranquil beauty. But this year, the serenity of the Rockies was interrupted by the arrival of the world's most powerful leaders, converging for a G7 summit that promised to be anything but peaceful. This was a G7 summit unlike any before, marked by unprecedented global tension and uncertainty. The stakes were higher than ever, and the eyes of the world were fixed on every move, every handshake, and every word exchanged behind closed doors. Tensions ran high, not just from routine disagreements over policy, but from a deep and widening ideological rift that threatened to split the group apart. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion, and every conversation seemed to carry the weight of history. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, hosting his first major summit, found himself at the center of two escalating crises: a US-led trade war that was shaking the foundations of the global economy, and a looming conflict between Israel and Iran that threatened to ignite the entire Middle East. President Trump's aggressive tariffs and combative rhetoric dominated the agenda, while the specter of war in the Middle East overshadowed any hope for unity or progress. The world watched as old alliances were tested and new divisions emerged. The leaders arrived seeking dialogue, but each was braced for confrontation, knowing that compromise would not come easily. Security was tight, and the mood was tense as delegations prepared for what many called the most consequential G7 in decades. The tranquil setting of Kananaskis, with its rolling forests and snow-capped peaks, stood in stark contrast to the summit's turbulent agenda. The natural beauty outside only highlighted the storm brewing within the conference halls. The G7's core values, free trade, democracy, and international cooperation, were under direct threat, challenged by rising nationalism and protectionism from within its own ranks. Instead of consensus, the summit quickly became a battleground for competing visions of the global order. Heated debates erupted, and the possibility of a unified statement seemed to slip further away with each passing hour. The central question loomed over every session. Could the G7 remain relevant in an era of rising nationalism, or was it destined to fracture under the weight of its own divisions? As the talks began, the world's press watched anxiously, waiting to see if the summit would bridge divides and restore faith in global cooperation, or if it would expose irreparable fractures that could reshape the international order for years to come. President Trump's America First trade policy took center stage, enforced with an unprecedented level of aggression and determination. Determined to shake up the global economic order, Trump made it clear that the era of what he called unfair trade was over. He imposed a staggering 50% tariff on imported steel and aluminum, a move that sent shockwaves through international markets and hit close allies like Canada and the European Union especially hard. These tariffs were designed to protect American industries, but they also risked igniting a trade war with some of the country's oldest partners. Next, a 25% tariff on foreign automobiles targeted major exporters like Germany and Japan. The goal was to force automakers to shift production to the United States, fundamentally reshaping global supply chains and challenging the business models of multinational corporations. Beyond these headline measures, Trump's administration announced a sweeping 10% tax on nearly all imported goods, putting pressure on every trading partner, large and small. No country was spared from the new tariffs, and the message was clear. America would no longer tolerate what it saw as one-sided trade. Trump gave countries just 90 days to come to the table and negotiate new trade deals, or else face even higher tariffs. The clock was ticking, and the world's economies scrambled to respond to the ultimatum. The administration justified these aggressive moves by citing national security concerns and the need to fund domestic tax cuts. Officials argued that a strong manufacturing base was essential for America's safety and prosperity. For Trump, it was about putting American interests first, reviving domestic industries, and restoring pride in products made in the USA. He promised that these tough measures would bring jobs back home and strengthen the nation's economy. But for the rest of the world, Trump's strategy looked like a reckless gamble, one that threatened to unravel decades of global trade cooperation and economic stability. Allies and rivals alike worried about the ripple effects on their own economies. The G7 leaders, caught off guard, faced an ultimatum rather than a negotiation. Tensions ran high as they debated how to respond to America's new hardline stance. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, one that could upend the global economy, disrupt markets, and redefine the rules of international trade for years to come. The G7 leaders responded to Trump's tariffs with rare unity and firm opposition. For many, it was a defining moment that tested the strength of the alliance and the principles of multilateral cooperation. The sudden imposition of tariffs by the United States sent shockwaves through the international community, prompting swift and coordinated reactions from America's closest allies. EU President Ursula von der Leyen called for a return to fair, predictable trade, rejecting US unilateralism. She emphasized that the European Union would not be intimidated and stressed the importance of upholding the rules-based international order. Her remarks reflected a broader European frustration with what was seen as an unpredictable shift in US policy. European Council President Antonio Costa highlighted the contradiction of demanding higher NATO spending while waging a trade war. He pointed out that such actions undermine trust and unity within the alliance, making it harder to address shared security challenges. Costa's comments resonated with other leaders who saw the tariffs as a threat to the very fabric of transatlantic cooperation. Canada's Mark Carney condemned the tariffs as unjustified, yet sought a diplomatic off-ramp. He urged all parties to engage in dialogue and avoid a full-blown trade war, warning that escalating tensions could have severe consequences for the global economy. Carney's approach reflected Canada's desire to preserve economic ties while standing firm against what it saw as unfair measures. A 30-day negotiation window offered a glimmer of hope, but tensions remained high. Behind closed doors, leaders scrambled to find common ground, aware that failure could lead to lasting damage. The atmosphere was tense, with every word and gesture scrutinized for signs of compromise or escalation. The G7, minus the US, presented a united front, viewing the tariffs as economic aggression. Their solidarity sent a clear message. They would not allow one nation's actions to undermine the collective interests of the group. This unity, however, also highlighted the growing rift between the US and its traditional partners. They argued the measures violated international rules and would hurt all sides. Leaders warned that protectionism could trigger retaliatory actions, disrupt supply chains, and ultimately harm workers and consumers across the globe. The summit shifted from cooperation to confrontation, with the US isolated. The traditional sense of camaraderie was replaced by suspicion and frustration as leaders struggled to bridge the widening gap. The G6 stood together, transforming the meeting into a tense standoff. Their determination to defend the global trading system was clear, even as the risk of a prolonged dispute loomed large. The traditional spirit of the G7 was replaced by open discord. What was once a forum for consensus had become a battleground for competing visions of the world economy. The world's leading democracies were now deeply divided, facing an uncertain future for their partnership and the global order they once championed together. The summit's divisions peaked when President Trump abruptly left Kananaskis a day early. Officially, he cited the escalating Israel-Iran crisis, but many saw it as a deliberate snub. His empty chair symbolized US disengagement and a turn toward unilateralism. Trump avoided final sessions and the joint press conference, controlling the narrative on his terms. His exit paralyzed remaining discussions. Any agreements were now symbolic. The G7's spirit of cooperation was shattered. Trump's departure signaled that, for him, the G7 was no longer the main stage for global decisions. The empty chair spoke volumes about the fractured Western alliance. After the summit, a brief 30-day negotiation window offered hope for compromise. But deep disagreements quickly resurfaced, and the spirit of negotiation evaporated. Trump remained convinced the US was being treated unfairly. Canada and the EU refused to yield. The calm after Kananaskis was short-lived. A larger storm was brewing. 10 days later, Trump suspended all trade talks with Canada, reacting to a new Canadian policy. The hope for a settlement vanished instantly. The move signaled the US was done with dialogue, ready to escalate. The summit, meant to unite allies, instead set the stage for a wider trade war. The fragile truce was shattered, and confrontation became inevitable. The trigger for Trump's break with Canada was a new digital services tax targeting US tech giants. Canada imposed a 3% levy on revenues of companies like Google and Meta, applied retroactively. US firms faced a sudden $2 billion tax bill, due immediately. Canada saw it as fairness. The US saw it as a punitive attack. Trump called the tax a blatant attack and suspended trade talks, threatening new tariffs on Canadian goods. The dispute moved the conflict into the digital economy, highlighting global divides over taxing big tech. Even as old issues simmered, new flashpoints emerged. The US-Canada relationship, once a model of cooperation, was now openly hostile. The digital tax standoff became the new front in the escalating trade war. Economic hostility replaced decades of partnership. The collapse of US-Canada talks and disputes with Europe signaled a new era of global trade conflict. Trump's unilateralism forced other countries to retaliate, fueling a cycle of escalation. The EU prepared its own tariffs, targeting politically sensitive US products. The world split, the US acting alone versus a coalition defending rules-based trade. The divide was both economic and ideological, cooperation versus competition. Businesses faced uncertainty, jobs were threatened, and consumers saw rising prices. The dream of seamless global trade faded, replaced by economic conflict. The G7 summit exposed these tensions, not resolved them. The global order was shifting, with alliances fraying. The world braced for a more divided, unpredictable future. While trade wars dominated, the Israel-Iran conflict cast a dark shadow over the G7. Israel's strikes on Iran's nuclear sites brought the Middle East to the brink of war. The crisis demanded attention, pulling focus from the economic agenda. The G7 managed a rare moment of unity, declaring Iran must never have a nuclear weapon. But deeper divisions remained on how to handle the crisis. Trump's confrontational approach and dramatic warnings heightened global alarm. His focus on Iran justified his early exit and sidelined other summit priorities. Planned meetings with Ukraine and Mexico were canceled, further marginalizing key issues. Trump questioned the G7's very composition, unsettling allies by suggesting Russia's return or even China's inclusion. The summit's divisions ran deeper than trade, touching the foundations of global alliances. The 2025 G7 in Kananaskis will be remembered for the divisions it exposed, not the agreements it reached. Instead of unity, the summit marked the fracturing of the Western alliance. The old consensus-driven order gave way to confrontation, led by Trump's America First doctrine. The fragility of the global trading system was laid bare, as decades of progress unraveled. Trump's tariffs triggered a cycle of retaliation, threatening economic stability worldwide. America's diplomatic isolation became stark, with the G6+1 a new reality. The summit showed that shared values could no longer be assumed. The world emerged more divided, tense, and uncertain. The era of easy cooperation was over. The future would demand new ways to manage conflict.